Welcome to the Point by TRB first episode. Today we'll be talking about the fraud of floating interest rates. Friends, interest rates are of two kinds, fixed and floating. When we take loans, either the loans are granted on fixed rate or on floating rate. Fixed rate is the rate which remains fixed during the entire tenure of the repayment of the loan. Mostly these are applicable to long-term loans like loans against property. Floating rate, as the name suggests, is a rate where the interest rate floats with the market rate. If the market rate of interest goes up, the floating rate too tends to go up, and if the market rate falls, the floating rate too goes down. It floats with the interest rate market. Now, the interest rate market is primarily determined by RBI repo rate. What is RBI repo rate? RBI repo rate is the rate at which RBI lends money to banks and is the foundational rate and key determinant of all lending rate in the entire economy. Banks and NBFCs mostly have their own base rates, which may be called with different names: MCLR, marginal cost of lending rate; EBLR, external benchmark lending rate; PLR, prime lending rate, etc. All these rates are supposed to float, which means they may go up and go down with the tide and ebb of interest rate market, which in turn is primarily determined by Reserve Bank of India's repo rate. Now we come to the rate charged to the borrower. How does it get fixed when one is opting for or one is prompted to opt for floating rate interest regime? The rate charged to the borrower in case of floating loans may be below or over the benchmark rate. What is the benchmark rate? It may be PLR, EBLR, MCLR. The difference is called spread. Spread may be negative or positive. The spread depends on the borrower's credit profile, the collateral offered, the CIBIL score, the negotiating ability or power of the borrower, and is normally mutually decided. For example, if PLR is 12% and spread is a negative 1.5%, then the actual rate payable by the borrower is 10.5%. Should the spread be 1.5% positive, then the same rate would go up to 13.5%. Now, for floating rate to be meaningful, there are a few things which are necessary. It has to be transparent. The underlying formula or equation should be predetermined and kick in automatically without intervention, either immediately or within a predetermined time lag with change in RBI repo rate, which determines the trajectory of the interest rate market for the entire economy. Now, normally the factors that go into determination of the benchmark rate besides the RBI repo rate are weighted average cost of funds for the lending institution. Like for banks, it may be the amount of CASA, the current account, saving account, funds available to the bank, fixed deposits and the interest rates being paid by the bank thereon, bonds, own capital, reserve funds, etc., and their estimated weightage in the funds basket. And for NBFCs, cost of deposits, loan funds, bonds, long-term and short-term capital, etc., are the factors and the cost thereof which would help in determining the aggregate or the weighted average cost of funds for that particular NBFC. Now, all these are the segments of the interest rate determination matrix. Now, for the whole thing to be transparent and without being in control of the lender, the weightage needs to be assigned beforehand and should remain fixed. The trouble is that the individual and MSME borrowers are not really well versed with the above intricacies and are sold and convinced to opt for floating rate interest without any intention to let the rate float transparently, honestly, automatically, and at given predetermined time frame. As a result, the hapless borrower gets defrauded. The base rate or the PLR or the MCLR or EBLR seldom goes down even as the market has sunk. However, if it does go, it is much less in proportion than the reduction in market interest rates. At the same time, it goes up disproportionately when market rate goes up. Also, the timing of rate reset is arbitrary. It is shorter when rates go up and longer when rates go down. And this is how the poor borrower is taken for a ride. Moreover, the hapless borrower is in a mousetrap, as the fine print on which he or she has no control, being the weaker party to the transaction, is used for such arbitrariness against the letter and spirit of the negotiated term sheet, which is the key document for any kind of lending. However, the contents of the negotiated term sheet are more often breached by the lenders by citing some obscure clause in the pre-printed standard agreement. I will give you an example here. You may consider it a case study. There is one company called Hero Fincorp Limited, which is an NBFC and lends funds at interest rate on its own framed and designed prime lending rate called Hero Fincorp Prime Lending Rate. The interest charged to the borrower on the amount lent may be fixed or floating. The company normally prompts borrower to opt for floating interest rate, citing that there is a possibility of interest rate market softening which may benefit the borrower. And borrower, with the impression that they may gain some advantage in a long-term loan, tends to opt for floating rate regime. I will take a particular case. In a case of a loan of a sum of rupees 500 lakhs, which was sanctioned by Hero Fincorp to the borrower in the year 2018, or I would say missold to the borrower at floating interest rate, giving the impression that the interest rates would get adjusted as and when the market softens up. The spread decided at the time was Hero Fincorp PLR minus a spread of 1.5%. At that time, the PLR was 12%, so the effective chargeable rate was 10.5%. It is to be noted that at the time of sanction of the loan, the repo rate was 6.25%. So effective spread from repo rate was 4.25% to arrive at the final payable rate of 10.5%. Immediately after sanction of loan, on the very next date, the repo rate increased by 0.25%, going up to 6.5%. And this fact was known at the time of sanction 2. Within 2-3 months of sanction of the loan, Hero Fincorp raised its PLR by a hopping 1%, thus increasing it from 12% to 13%, and effective rate which was chargeable to the borrower from 10.5% to 11.5%. Thereafter, repo rate started softening from year 2019 and gradually came down to as low as 4% in the year 2020 and remained at 4% till May 2022, when it was raised from 4% to 4.4%. Repo rate chart gives all the detail. You will notice that the repo rate as of 6 June 2018 was 6.25%. 1st August 2018 it became 6.5%. 7th February it was reduced again to 6.25%. 4th April 19 it was 6%. 6 June 19 it became 5.75%. 7th August it became 5.4%. 6th February 2020 it was 5.15%. 27th March 2020 it became 4.4% and remained and further got reduced to 4% on 22nd May 2020 and remained 4% till 9th October till May 2022, when it was raised to 4.4%. Considering such massive fall in the repo rate, the borrower approached Hero FinCorp asking it to reduce its PLR, or whether its PLR has been reduced or not, to which no satisfactory response was ever given, or the information given that whether the PLR has been reduced or not reduced. Borrower asked them that you had raised interest rate by 1% on a 0.25% increase in repo rate. Why has there been no adjustment, no downward adjustment in repo rate in Hero FinCorp PLR, despite a massive reduction of almost 2.5% in repo rate? Why was it not happening? It was not happening because there was no transparency, because there was no desire to bring the rates in a sinking market in tandem with market rates. When no satisfactory response was forthcoming, the borrower sought to foreclose the account. When an account with a sterling track record was getting foreclosed, they wanted to retain the account by saying that we will reduce the rate of interest by 1%. However, they wanted to charge 29,500 rupees as rate reset charges, which was an absurdity. While the borrower was asking for a reduction in rate, that is the PLR, and let the account remain on floating rate regime, effectively by backdoor, by charging 29,500, they wanted to reduce the character of the account to a fixed rate regime by offering a fixed rate which was lesser by 1%. Having been fed up by this obstinate and obstructive attitude of the company, the borrower repaid the loan in full by 2022 and got itself out of the usurious and exploited clutches of the company. From this episode, it can be observed that banks, NBFCs, financiers are literally looting the hard-earned money of the helpless and uneducated, unaware borrower by abusing their dominant position in the transaction. While being in fiduciary position and a position of trust, they are indulging in thuggery, and this is across the board, whether it be banks or NBFCs, private banks, scheduled commercial nationalized banks. It is almost across the board. While the chicanery is less prominent in scheduled commercial banks, particularly nationalized banks, it is rampant in private banks and in NBFCs. In this one single course of Hero FinCorp, the borrowers have ended up being defrauded to the tune of over rupees 400 crores in a span of 1-2 years. Imagine the quantum of amount of additional money collected by the entire system. It may be in tens of thousands of crores of rupees from small borrowers, individuals, MSMEs. Unfortunately, Reserve Bank of India has ignored this despite it being fully in their knowledge. I do not know the exact reasons, but what appears to me is that by looting the small borrower, the banks have been allowed to make good of the huge losses they made on their NPAs and to make good for their past sins. Now, what is the recourse available to the borrowers? The important thing is, what has happened is happened, but it should stop. And for stopping this, the borrowers en masse need to rise up and seek a fair, transparent and honest interest rate regime which is beyond the control of the lender, particularly in case of floating rate of interest. The float should be absolutely natural, should rise with the rise in market rates and should fall when the market rates fall, and it should not be tied on the banks that when the water rises, it rises, and when water falls, the binding on the tying up of the rates on the banks of the river does not allow it to fall. For this purpose, I would request borrowers, I would suggest that borrowers file criminal complaints against financiers for breach of trust and using fraudulent means for pecuniary gains to induce borrowers to part with their money. Next, they may also file civil suits for recovery of extra interest so charged by the financiers or the banks. The borrowers must raise complaints to Reserve Bank of India, to Ministry of MSME, to Ministry of Finance, and all by speed post to maintain, to track the post sent and its receipt. It also needs to raise complaint with Competition Commission of India, which easily does not take cognizance of this difficulty or this situation of abuse of a weaker party to the transaction by the dominant party. It has dismissed a petition filed in this regard on absolute technical grounds without going in for a larger inquiry into the entire transactional system and transactional universe of lending to small borrowers by banks and NBFCs, and how the people are exploited and abused. Besides this, one may write letters to editor and post on social media and blogs. After sending letters, it is advised that borrowers file applications under RTI Act, Right to Information Act, as to what action has been taken on their application. If all these acts are carried out by a large number of borrowers and the system is flooded with complaints, some corrective action is bound to take place. I request you all to kindly make this video viral so that it reaches the right quarters and we, the borrower class, are saved from this kind of abuse, exploitation and loot. Thank you.